Hi, this is another of my videos about The Walking Dead, focusing on season 2 of the series. And this is a kind of follow-up to my most recent video, which was about the importance of Hershel's farm as a setting for season 2. If you haven't seen that previous video, and if I remember, I'll post a link in the description here so you can go back to it. You should watch that video first because this one I want to make a lot shorter, and it kind of builds on the central ideas of that previous video. So I'd say watch that video first if you're interested. So I realized after I made the video this morning, I was driving around and I thought, oh, there are 3 things I forgot to say. So these are 3 things that I think are really important as kind of add-ons to what I said in that most recent video. So the first thing has to do, if you've watched the previous video, you know that my argument was that Hershel's farm represented what I called a pastoral enclosure. And the pastoral enclosure is a space in the country that's enclosed, and it's set off from or divided from the outside world, which is usually in the pastoral, and the pastoral dates back literally thousands of years. The pastoral keeps itself separate from the city. And I said, you know, there are lots of sort of literal and symbolic ways in which we see this separation of farm from city, of the pastoral enclosure from the city. And I said the best example of this is probably just the spatial, the space of the farm. So that we have the farmhouse, we have the yard, we have the barbed wire fence, we have the field, we have the forest, we have the creek, we have the highway, then way beyond that we have the city. So the city is really separated by a bunch of boundaries or buffer spaces from the pastoral enclosure. And one of the things that I said in my video is that the pastoral enclosure is supposed to be uncorrupted by that city. And the pastoral enclosure is a space in the country where people not just are eternally happy, which is one of the arguments that I later debunk in my previous video, but the pastoral space is often represented as a space for healing. And think about this in sort of modern life, that people go to the cottage or go to the lake, and it's to get away from the busyness and the business of the city. Sort of leave your cell phone behind, leave the work worries behind, and go to a place that's peaceful and serene, and that is, as Rick says to Hershel, untouched by that outside world, that it's innocent in some way. So you go to this space to be healed, to sort of renew your spiritual health, recharge your spiritual batteries. One of the things that I forgot to say in my previous video is that Hershel's farm, as pastoral enclosure, Hershel's farm is also a site of literal healing. Carl, right? I can't believe I forgot to talk about Carl, who is wounded, nearly dies from his gunshot wound, and he's brought to the farm, to the pastoral enclosure, to be healed by Hershel. So there could be all this spiritual healing that the pastoral setting represents, but Carl and his healing is the literal act that really represents the idea of healing in the pastoral space on a more figurative level. So that's the first thing. Pastoral is healing space. The second thing that I forgot to mention somehow is the fences. When I talked about this idea about how the farm is set off from the city and there are all these boundaries or buffer zones between the farm and the city, I forgot to talk about what happens in the second to last episode of season 2, the Better Angels episode. And what we see at the beginning of that episode is that Rick has taken charge again and is directing people. And he's directing them to set up, first to make the house a safer place, and remember that Hershel has now said to the group, you can move inside the house now. And Rick basically sets up a perimeter. He wants all of the vehicles facing out. He assigns watch duties to people. Shane goes up and begins to build this watchtower when Lori comes to talk to him. And we also see Shane checking the perimeter fence, right? He's walking along. I can't remember who's driving along beside him, but he's literally, physically checking the fence. And the fence seems very sturdy and secure, physically and literally, but it's way too late for that now. And the reason for that is, if that fence is meant to keep out the contamination of the outside world, it's too late for that. And for 2 reasons, that I discussed in my previous video. One is that the farm is already contaminated. We know that because of that bloated walker who falls into the well and contaminates the water. And I said water, traditionally a symbol of purity. When the water is contaminated, it suggests that the space of the farm is contaminated. The second important thing to note here is that the boundaries of the farm are, useful for keeping out walkers, although walkers wander onto the farm or near the farm, and Hershel, collects them in the barn. But what's important here is that they're checking the fences and securing the perimeter for another reason, not just because of walkers, but because of the other group, the group that's identified with the town, the urban space, the city, because that's where Rick and Hershel and Glenn first encounter those two guys in the Nebraska episode. So, and what happens is that just in the next episode, they bring Randall from the town into the farm. So you can set up those perimeters against the outside world as much as you want. Too late. The characters, guided by Rick, have already deliberately and willingly brought that outside influence from outside the farm, from the town. They've brought that outside influence into the pastoral space willingly. And I said in the last video that the pastoral space, as great a haven as it is always corrupted. Death and corruption always get into the pastoral, no matter how hard anyone tries to protect those borders. The third thing that I forgot to mention was somehow the walkers themselves, right? At the end of the Better Angels episode, we see that struggle between Shane and Rick. And it is largely, if not completely, that the sounds of that violent encounter that draw the zombies out of the forest and toward the farm. So that episode ends, we see the walkers in the forest. Then we see them coming in a huge wave out of the forest. There's one border gone, coming across the fields, and they're going to obviously transgress these borders. Out of the forest, through the field, past the barbed wire fence, through the yard, and to the house, presumably, where there will be death and mayhem. I expect Hershel will die because he's the embodiment of the pastoral in this season generally. I kind of expect Carol to die too, because with Sophia gone, there isn't much for her to do. So I forgot to talk about the walkers, and what I was saying to wrap up my previous video was that the best example of how the pastoral space has become completely contaminated, beyond the contaminated well, beyond bringing Randall there, is when, instigated by Shane, they kill all of the walkers in the barn, including Sophia, right? And Sophia, as a child, should be symbolic of innocence. Well, she isn't anymore because she's been bitten and corrupted, no longer human, and she is killed, finally, in this pastoral space, which is becoming contaminated. And I said that the massacre outside the barn is the best example of how the pastoral enclosure has become a fallen world, just like Eden was a pastoral enclosure of sorts, and it becomes corrupted by that serpent and eating from the tree of knowledge, and it becomes a fallen world. That happens too at the massacre. But the biggest example of how the fallen world is now going to encroach upon and breach the boundaries of the pastoral enclosure is all those walkers coming at the end of the episode and the preview we see for next episode. Can't believe I forgot that. So the three things I forgot, just to review: Carl's literal healing in the pastoral space, the fences and how they're going to fail because these characters have already willingly allowed aspects of the town to come into the pastoral space. And then third, how all those walkers are going to breach all those boundaries, make their attack, and this pastoral enclosure of Hershel's farm will become part of and indistinguishable from the fallen world that it was trying to keep away on the outside. Hope this makes sense to people. What I like, if you enjoy these videos at all, is if you have a suggestion for a topic or an episode or something that you have a question about. Doesn't mean I have all the answers, But I have some ideas of things that I might want to address. If you have ideas about something you'd like to see addressed here or questions, I don't present myself as an expert on the series. I don't even know the comic book, but I'm happy to try to answer questions or discuss aspects of the show that people are interested in. So that's it for now. Thanks.